The wind howled across the cracked earth, sweeping dust into the air like an agitated, invisible beast. Jed Thompson stood on the porch of his weather-beaten cabin, his rough hands gripping the railing and his gaze fixed on the horizon, where the sun dipped low, painting the sky in gold and crimson. Evenings like these were when the loneliness bit deepest, when the silence stretched so far that he felt he might fall into it and never come back. The creak of a loose board drew him back, and his son's small voice broke the silence. "Pa, is dinner ready yet?" Tommy's blonde hair stood out in tousled tufts, his cheeks smudged with dirt from playing near the chicken coop. Jed forced a smile, but it did not reach his eyes. "Soon, son. We just need to check the traps." He looked down at the boy, who was full of life despite everything they had lost. Tommy was his last hope for happiness. His wife Sarah had been gone for 2 years, killed by a fever that swept through the town mercilessly. He buried her on the hill behind the cabin, beneath a willow whose branches swayed in mourning. They survived, but only just. Jed did his best to keep the farm running, but it had been falling apart long before Sarah died. Livestock died, crops failed frequently, and the constant drought made the soil as brittle as his resolve. He earned a few dollars by doing odd jobs around town, such as breaking horses or mending fences for men who were better off than him. He rarely went into town, except for supplies. People there had been kind enough during Sarah's illness, but pity turned to impatience when he failed to recover to his old reliable self. He noticed it in their eyes. Expectation turned into disdain. Jed Thompson, the man who used to laugh louder than anyone else in the saloon, was reduced to a grim shadow, working himself into the ground. Jed's boots crunched against the gravel as he walked toward the traps set along the edge of his property. His rifle rested heavily on his shoulder, more out of habit than necessity. He'd learned the hard way that coyotes didn't respect boundaries, just like the debt collectors who would soon come knocking if he didn't find a way to pay off his debt. Returning to the cabin with 2 scrawny rabbits, he lit a fire and roasted them over the hearth. The scent of charred meat permeated the small room, mingling with the dusty, stale air. Tommy ate greedily while chatting about his day, his imagination spinning grand tales of cowboys and bandits. Jed listened, nodding along, his responses limited to grunts of acknowledgement. That night, as Tommy fell asleep beneath a worn blanket, Jed sat by the fire, his eyes hollow and fixed on the dying embers. The ache of Sarah's absence never faded. It simply changed shape, settling into his bones like an old injury. The prospect of meeting someone new felt like a betrayal, but the weight of loneliness threatened to crush him if he didn't find a way to share the burden. A pounding on the door startled him awake, but he hadn't realized he'd been dozing. The sun had not yet risen, and the world outside was painted in shades of ink and shadow. Tommy stirred, but did not awaken, his breathing gentle and even. Jed opened the door to find Old Man Higgins standing on the porch, his gray beard and tattered hat covered in dust. Higgins ran the livery and had an uncanny ability to know everyone's business, whether they wanted him to or not. "Jed," the old man rasped, his voice like gravel, "you should come down to the station." Jed frowned as he noticed a bit of a spectacle brewing. "What has this got to do with me?" Higgins scratched his chin. A bride arrived on the morning train. Trouble is, the man who was supposed to meet her never showed up, leaving her stranded. And people are, well, being their usual gracious selves. Jed paused. He didn't want to get entangled in someone else's mess, but something in Higgins's tone made him pause. "Why have you contacted me about this?" Jed inquired, his voice tight with suspicion. "Because you're not like the rest of them," Higgins responded, "and I believe you should see for yourself before things worsen." Curiosity combined with a reluctant sense of duty drew Jed from the cabin, leaving Tommy still sleeping. The town's train station consisted of a wooden platform and a shack where the station master kept track of schedules and sorted freight. A small crowd had formed, their voices rising with sharp-edged laughter. As Jed approached, he noticed Maggie Mayfield. She stood near her trunks, shoulders hunched, as if bracing for a storm. She was large, yes, but not in the way that made her an easy target for the cruel remarks directed at her. Her presence was solid, and Jed felt small and hollow in comparison. Someone in the crowd sneered, "She's too fat for her own good." "I cannot believe any man would want her." "She'll eat him out of house and home," said another, spitting tobacco into the dust. Maggie kept her chin up and her gaze fixed straight ahead, but Jed could see the pain in her eyes, sharp and raw like an open wound. He watched her for a moment, torn between turning away and moving forward. Pity sparked something else in him, a flash of rage at the cruelty these townspeople displayed so easily. He cleared his throat. "What's the problem here?" The crowd's eyes narrowed as they recognized him. Jed was never one to meddle, but he couldn't bring himself to walk away this time. "No problem, Jed," Higgins responded from somewhere in the crowd. "Just a woman waiting for a man who will never come." Maggie's eyes met his, her defiance barely masking the pain. Jed could tell she was trying to keep it together, but the strain was obvious. He looked at her trunks, 2 large battered cases, and a satchel that appeared to be about to burst at the seams. "Were you planning to go?" Jed inquired, ignoring the whispers and snickers from the audience. Her voice was strong, but Jed could detect a tremor beneath the surface. "I was promised a place here, and a fresh start." "That seems like a lie." He nodded slowly. "And you have nowhere else to go?" "Nowhere at all," she admitted, her shoulders slumping under the weight of her own words. Jed scratched his beard, feeling the crowd's eyes burning into him like hot coals. He owed this woman nothing. He could barely feed himself and Tommy, but something about her, the way she refused to buckle under the weight of their scorn, triggered an old instinct in him. "I have a place," he said, surprising himself. "A little run down, but you're welcome to stay until you figure out your next move." The shock on her face quickly turned to suspicion. "Why would you do that?" Jed shrugged. "Because I understand what it's like to have nowhere else to go." Higgins chuckled from behind him. "Ain't that a sight? Jed Thompson taking in a stray?" The crowd began to disperse, their interest waning now that the spectacle had concluded. Maggie looked at Jed, searching for any signs of cruelty or deception. When she found none, she nodded, her voice more steady than before. "I sincerely thank you, Mr. Thompson." "It's just Jed," he said, grabbing one of her trunks and carrying it over his shoulder. "Come on, let's get moving before the heat sets in." As they walked out of the station, her steps heavy but determined beside him, Jed couldn't help but feel something shift inside him. A faint and unfamiliar warmth seeped through the cracks in his loneliness. He couldn't name it just yet, but it was enough to keep him going. Maggie's first morning at the Thompson homestead began with the sound of roosters crowing and the acrid aroma of coffee boiling over a fire that sputtered rather than crackled. The cabin was small, its walls thin and drafty, and the floorboards creaked beneath her every step. She awoke before dawn, the discomfort of a night spent on a lumpy cot only strengthening her resolve. The place was in bad shape, but she'd seen worse. Jed went about his chores like a man possessed, his movements clipped and efficient, his expression unreadable. She saw the exhaustion stamped deep into his features, the gauntness caused by too many missed meals and insufficient rest. Maggie sensed something kinder beneath that gruff exterior, which he guarded as fiercely as a man would protect his gold. Tommy greeted her with a wide, gap-toothed smile, his enthusiasm unwavering. "You going to be staying, Miss Maggie?" he asked, clutching a wooden toy horse he had whittled from scrap. "For a while, I reckon," she replied, her voice firm. "As long as your father is willing to have me around." Tommy's smile broadened. "I like having you here. Pa doesn't laugh much anymore, but you make him smile." Maggie's cheeks flushed, and she didn't know what to say, so she focused on finding something useful to do. The kitchen was little more than a corner of the cabin, a rickety table stacked with dented pots and knives dulled by use. She set about cleaning, her hands finding a rhythm in the scrubbing and sorting. The activity calmed her nerves, which buzzed like a hive full of angry bees. She needed to prove herself useful, to show Jed that she was worth more than the pity he had shown her by offering shelter. By midday, she had swept the cabin, washed the dishes, and patched a tear in Tommy's shirt. Her hands ached, but the ache was a welcome distraction from the gnawing anxiety that clung to her. She had previously been abandoned and humiliated. When Jed returned from the cage fields, sweat glistening on his brow and dirt streaked across his arms, she had a simple meal prepared for him. His eyes widened slightly as he took in the spread of boiled potatoes and a stew made from the last of the salted pork. But he said nothing, just sat down and ate with the quiet intensity of a man who was starving. Maggie felt she had done something right when he shoveled food into his mouth, as if he hadn't had a proper meal in months, despite the fact that his words were as measured as his steps. "Good," he muttered between bites. Maggie watched him, looking for any indication that her efforts were appreciated. Tommy dragged her outside after supper, his energy boundless despite the waning daylight, and showed her the chicken coop, goat pen, and crooked fence that lined the north pasture. The place was barely holding together, but it had a rough charm that spoke of hard work and tenacity, Tommy admitted, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Pa says it's all going to hell, but I think you can help us fix it." Maggie laughed, a deep rolling sound that startled the boy. "You're strong enough, but it'll take more than muscle to mend what's broken here." Tommy insisted. "Then you can use your brains too. Pa says folks are mean to you because you're big, but I think big means you're tougher." Her smile faltered, but she ruffled his hair and nodded. Maggie threw herself into the tasks Jed reluctantly assigned her, mending fences, clearing debris from the fields, and digging a new trench to keep water from pooling near the barn during the rains. The following few days were a blur of work and aching muscles. Every evening, she prepared supper and sat with Jed and Tommy around the rough-hewn table. Conversation remained sparse, but the air grew warmer and less strained. Jed's eyes followed her progress, his expression unreadable, but his silence no longer seemed so hostile. Tommy talked about his adventures with the chickens and his dreams of one day taming wild horses. Jed listened, but his gaze was frequently drawn to Maggie, and his brow furrowed. When Jed rode into town for supplies, he returned with a clenched jaw and eyes filled with unspoken rage, as if she were a puzzle he couldn't quite solve. Word of her presence spread quickly throughout the town, and it wasn't all positive. Maggie suspected he had endured more than his fair share of insults on her behalf. "Walker's been sniffing around," he told her one evening, his voice tight. "Claims you're a witch cast spells on me and Tommy," Maggie asked, her fingers clenching around the spoon she was stirring stew with. "He said he saw you working on the fences and swears you fixed them faster than any man could. Does he believe it, or is he just looking for trouble?" Jed responded, "Man has a grudge against me because I refused to sell him this land years ago, and now that it's falling apart, he thinks he can run me off." Maggie said firmly, "Let him think whatever he wants. I'm not afraid of him," which is easy to say now. Jed's gaze was sharp, and his expression was harder than she'd ever seen it. "But Walker has more money and influence than you or me. Money doesn't make a man strong, and it certainly doesn't make him right," Jed grunted. But there was something admirable in his eyes, and I'd be a fool if I didn't keep my guard up. Maggie discovered a satisfaction in the labor she hadn't expected. The soil was stubborn, the tools dull, but her hands grew calloused and her muscles stronger with each passing day. They worked side by side, sometimes in silence. She found herself laughing more, her voice startling the quiet air around the cabin. Tommy's antics made her smile, his boyish exuberance infectious. Jed softened, though he never admitted it outright. One frigid morning, just after dawn, she noticed him staring at her, his gaze distant and thoughtful. The nights grew colder, but the cabin felt warmer, as if her presence had reignited an old fire. Maggie had woken up early, her breath fogging the air as she went to fetch water from the creek. She heard the hoofbeats first, a rumble that grew louder until she saw them. A group of riders thundering up the path toward the cabin. Sam Walker stood in the front, his face twisted into a sneer. "Thompson." Walker's voice broke through the chill. "I've come for what's mine." Jed emerged from the cabin, rifle in hand, but pointing at the ground. His eyes narrowed as he took in the riders, his shoulders braced for a fight. "You've got nothing here, Walker." Walker snapped, holding up a roll of parchment. "Go back to town. I've got claims that say otherwise. You've been squatting on this land for too long. Either pay up or leave. I may not owe you anything, but that woman you took in has the devil's hand." Maggie stepped forward before Jed could respond. Her chin lifted defiantly. "People have seen her working your land like a man possessed, which isn't natural and certainly not right." Walker's eyes narrowed, his mouth twisting with disdain. "If you're afraid of a woman doing a man's work, then perhaps it's you who is unnatural. You think you're safe here. But if you keep talking like that, you'll get burned out. I can make things really difficult for you, woman." Walker laughed, but it was a brittle sound devoid of genuine humor, and Jed's voice cut through his hair like a blade. "If you ever set foot on my land again, I'll make sure you regret it. You've made your decision, Thompson. But don't say I didn't warn you." The riders turned and left, their threats hanging heavy in the air. Maggie looked at Jed. Her breath caught at the hardness in his gaze. "You didn't have to defend me," she said. Jed's voice was low, and his words were weighted with an unexpected truth. "Yes, I did." The weeks that followed were a blur of labor and fleeting moments of something like contentment. Maggie threw herself into the work with a determination that verged on desperation, mending fences, patching the barn's roof where the wind had torn shingles loose, and clearing rocks from the field so the soil could breathe again. Her muscles burned with the effort, and her hands became rough and calloused. But the pain was welcome. It proved she could contribute, that she wasn't just an unwanted burden cast upon Jed's dwindling resources. Jed watched her from the corner of his eye, his expression often unreadable. She could sense his suspicion of her strength, his bewilderment at her resilience. She caught him staring on several occasions, his gaze curious and calculating, as if he were trying to solve a puzzle he hadn't asked for. But there was also something else there, something softer beneath the harsh exterior he clung to like armor. Tommy was her greatest joy. The boy took to her like a duck to water, following her around the homestead with boundless energy she envied, and peppering her with questions as she worked, his curiosity insatiable. How had she learned to mend fences so quickly? Why did she know how to drive nails and haul lumber as well as any man? "Back home, my parents had a farm," Maggie told him one afternoon, her voice steady as she pounded nails into the splintered wood of the goat pen. "When my brother died, there was no one else to do the work, so I learned I had to." Tommy's eyes widened. "But you're a lady. Aren't ladies supposed to wear dresses and sit all pretty?" Maggie laughed, the sound deep and rolling like thunder over the plains. "Some ladies do, but I've never liked sitting around. I prefer to keep my hands busy." Maggie looked over her shoulder toward the cabin, where Jed was busy repairing the porch steps. "You sound like Pa," Tommy said, his voice solemn. "He doesn't sit much either, not unless he's too tired to move." Tommy nodded, but there was a shadow in his eyes Maggie couldn't quite place. He didn't speak of his mother often, but she'd seen him staring at the willow tree on the hill more than once, his small face drawn with a sadness far too heavy for a child his age. Maggie understood the weight of grief better than most. It had chased her across states, gnawing at her insides with a persistence that left her breathless at times. She tried to lift the boy's spirits with stories, spinning wild tales of knights and dragons as they gathered eggs from the coop or washed clothes in the creek. Tommy loved Maggie's stories, and he would run to Jed, breathless with excitement, recounting Maggie's most recent tale with the zeal of a preacher delivering a sermon. Jed's reaction varied. Maggie saw how he looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, his gaze lingering with a mixture of gratitude and something else she couldn't quite name. Sometimes he would grunt in acknowledgement, his focus fixed on whatever task lay before him. Other times, a brief and fragile smile would flicker across his lips, leaving Maggie wondering if she had only imagined it. Maggie tried not to think about her growing affection for him. It was foolish to imagine anything more than what they already had, a tenuous alliance built on necessity and shared hardship. Jed had made no promises or reassurances beyond his reluctant acceptance of her presence, but the way he treated her, his careful consideration, even when his words were clipped and brusque, gave her hope. She spent her nights lying awake on the narrow cot Jed had set up for her in the corner of the cabin. The room was small, and their lives were crammed together in a space that felt both suffocating and oddly comforting. Maggie had never known the quiet harmony of living alongside others, rather than simply existing in their shadow. She could hear Jed's steady and deep breathing in the darkness, as well as Tommy's occasional murmurs as he dreamed of horses and heroes. Sam Walker, the troublemaker, returned. The man was relentless, his obsession with the Thompson land growing more dangerous with each passing day. He sent men to harass them, their taunts carrying over the fields like poisoned arrows. They left dead animals by the creek, scrawled threats on the side of the barn, and tried to scare Maggie away with jeers about her size and supposed witchcraft. "You ain't safe here, woman," one of Walker's men sneered one afternoon as she hauled a bucket of water from the well. "Best leave before things get ugly." Maggie met his gaze with a steadiness that sent a chill down the man's spine. "I've dealt with uglier men than you. Now get off this land before I decide to chase you off myself." He left grumbling, but not before spitting into the dirt at her feet. Maggie returned to her chores, her heart pounding with anger and something darker. She had come here for a fresh start, but it appeared that trouble had followed her like a curse. Jed confronted Walker one morning after discovering a section of the fence torn down and cattle driven off into the wild. His fury was palpable, his voice low and sharp as he spoke to Maggie before riding away from town. "I'm going to end this," he said, his eyes like flint. "Walker's gone too far. Stealing livestock, vandalizing the barn. He wants me to break, but I won't give him the satisfaction. Maybe I should go," Maggie suggested, her voice strained. "If it's me he's after, I won't cause any more harm to you or Tommy." Jed's eyes softened, his shoulders relaxed, as if the suggestion itself had wounded him. "This isn't your fault, Maggie. Walker has been trying to force me out. This land existed long before you showed up. You've been a help to me, Tommy, and I won't have you running away because of some coward's schemes." "Then let me help you fight," Maggie said, her voice fierce. "You can't do it alone, and neither can I." His lips twitched into what might have been a smile. "You got more fight in you than most men I know. I reckon I could use the help." They spent the following days reinforcing the Yeehan fences, setting traps around the perimeter of the property, and stockpiling what little supplies they could afford. Maggie's strength proved invaluable, impressing even Jed with her ability to haul lumber and swing a hammer with the same precision as any man. Tommy remained blissfully unaware of the danger that hovered like a storm cloud over their little homestead, and his laughter rang out across the fields, a stubborn defiance against the darkness that threatened to consume them all. Their conversations became more frequent, and their silences became less uneasy. Maggie sat on the porch beside Jed, their legs dangling over the edge. The sky had turned a deep, velvety blue, the stars shimmering like jewels scattered across dark silk. The air was crisp, a cool breeze rustling the leaves of the willow tree on the hill. "You don't have to stay, you know," Jed said suddenly, his voice so quiet she almost didn't hear him. Maggie frowned as she looked at him. "Do you want me to leave?" "No," he said, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "But I can't ask you to stay either, not when there's so much risk." "You're not asking me to stay. I chose to." She paused, her voice low. "And not just because I've got nowhere else to go." His eyes met hers then, something raw and vulnerable flickering in their depths. "You've made things better around here, Tommy. He's happier with you around, and so am I." Maggie's breath caught, her heart racing in her chest. "Then I'll stay," she whispered. "As long as you want." Phi, too. The morning dawned cold and brittle, with air sharp enough to cut skin. Maggie awoke to the sound of hoofbeats echoing against the frost-hardened earth, their rhythm urgent and unyielding. She stood up from her cot, her bones creaking from the strain of another sleepless night. Jed's warning had been clear. Walker would not stop until the Thompsons were evicted from their land. Maggie's presence had only fueled the fire, and her defiance was an insult that Walker would not tolerate. She put on her boots and stepped outside to find Jed already saddling his horse. Tommy hovered nearby, clutching his wooden horse with knuckles turned white from the cold. His jaw was clenched, his eyes darkened by exhaustion that could hollow out a man's soul. "What is going on?" Maggie inquired, her voice rough from disuse. Walker's men ripped down the fences again, drove the cattle away, and left tracks as clear as day, as if they wanted me to know who did it. Jed's voice was a snarl, his rage barely contained. Maggie clenched her fists at her sides. "You can't keep going after them alone. They'll kill you if you push them too far. Better to die fighting than let that bastard steal what's mine," Jed snapped, though his rage wasn't truly directed at her. "I'll head out and see if I can catch up to them before they reach the river. I'm coming with you." The words left her mouth before she'd even fully considered them, but there was no mistaking her resolve. Jed turned to face her, his eyes narrowing. Don't do that. This is my fight." "It's ours," she corrected, her voice firm. "As you stated, I've been a help to you. Well, let me help you now. We can't keep playing defense while Walker tears this place apart piece by piece." Jed looked at her for a long moment, his expression unreadable, before nodding, though his shoulders remained tense. "Fine, but you stay behind me, and if anything goes wrong, get the hell out of there. Understand?" Maggie returned his gaze with unwavering determination. "I'm not running, Jed. Not from this." They rode out together, the cold air biting at their faces as they followed the trail of broken fences and scattered hoofprints. The landscape stretched out before them in a harsh, unforgiving sprawl of dust and rock. Maggie's muscles ached from the strain of gripping the reins, but she ignored it. There was no room for weakness right now. Two of Walker's men stood by the river's edge, rifles slung over their shoulders and sneers plastered across their faces. The animals were huddled together, confused and restless. Maggie slid from her horse, her boots crunching against the frostbitten grass. One of them drawled, his voice thick with condescension. "It appears Thompson has brought himself a bodyguard, and a woman at that. You boys better start walking before I decide to teach you a lesson in manners." The men exchanged glances, their amusement morphing into something far uglier. The taller of the two took a step forward, resting his hand on the buttstock of his rifle. "You're a mouthy one, aren't you?" he sneered. "Maybe you need to learn your place." Jed's voice cut through the air like a blade. "Touch her and you'll be picking your teeth out of the dirt." The man hesitated, but arrogance won out over caution. He took another step forward, his grin spreading. "Ain't nobody here but you and the lady. Walker's got more men than you could ever handle, and I reckon he'll pay us a pretty penny to drag you back to him, broken and bleeding." Maggie saw the flash of movement before Jed did, the other man lifting his rifle with deadly intent, and she grabbed the shotgun strapped to her saddle and fired without thinking. The blast echoed across the riverbank, the recoil jolting her arms with brutal force. The man's rifle clattered to the ground as he fell, his screams splintering the air, the taller man's expression twisted from confidence to terror, and he reached for his weapon, but Jed was quicker. A single shot from his revolver sent the man sprawling, the frost beneath him stained with blood. Maggie breathed in ragged gasps, her heart pounding so loudly that she couldn't hear anything else. For a moment, silence hung heavy and absolute. She looked at Jed, his face pale but composed, his eyes glinting with a mixture of respect and fear. "Damn, Maggie," he breathed. "You just saved my life." She swallowed, her throat tightening. It had to be done. They gathered the cattle and drove them back to the homestead with an urgency born of necessity. They didn't say much on the ride back, their silence weighted by the violence that had erupted so suddenly. Maggie's hands trembled around the reins, her mind replaying the moment of the gun's discharge over and over, until it became little more than a blur of sound and motion. When they arrived at the cabin, Tommy ran out to greet them, his expression a mix of relief and confusion. Maggie slid from her horse, her legs weak and unsteady. She tried to conceal the tremors from Tommy's watchful gaze, but the boy was sharper than most. "Did you catch the bad guys?" he inquired, his voice small and brittle. Jed nodded, his voice soft. "We did, and they won't be bothering us anymore." Tommy looked to Maggie, his eyes wide and searching. "Are you suffering from injuries?" "No, Tommy, just tired." Maggie forced a smile, but it felt like a lie even as she spoke. Maggie and Jed reinforced the fences, stockpiled ammunition, and made sure the barn was secure against any further attempts at sabotage in the days that followed. Walker's presence loomed over them like a dark cloud, infecting the town like a disease. Maggie bore the scorn with as much dignity as she could muster, but the weight of it grew heavier with each passing day. The townspeople grew distant, avoiding Maggie whenever she went into the general store or the post office. Whispers followed, her cruel words slithering between the cracks of civility. Jed remained steadfast, his loyalty unshaken by the gossip that swirled around them. His love for her had grown into something solid and unspoken, a bond forged through shared hardship and quiet understanding. They spent their evenings together on the porch, their conversations growing longer and less guarded. Maggie found herself drawn to Jed's stubborn kindness, his rough edges softened by moments of unexpected gentleness. He spoke of Sarah with reverence, his voice thick with the pain of loss and gratitude for what he had once known. "You," Jed said one night, his gaze fixed on the horizon. "You've got the same fire she had, the same damn determination to keep going no matter how hard the world tries to break you." "I'm not trying to replace her," Maggie whispered, her fingers twisting nervously in her lap. Jed shook his head. "I know, and that's what makes it important. You're here because you want to be, not because someone asked you to." The moment stretched out between them, raw and exposed. Maggie felt tears welling up behind her eyes, but she held them back, because she couldn't afford to be vulnerable in the face of the world's determination to bring her down. 3 days later, the final confrontation took place. Maggie stood beside Jed, her shotgun clutched tightly in her hands, as Walker and his men rode onto the property, rifles drawn and cruelty etched in their faces. There would be no retreat or negotiation this time. Maggie fired until her arms ached, her vision blurred from the smoke and adrenaline. Walker's men fell one by one, their arrogance undone by desperation. Walker was the last to fall, his eyes wide with disbelief as Jed's bullet tore through him. Maggie stood trembling but unbroken when the dust settled. The land was theirs, finally and completely, and as Jed drew her into his arms, his embrace fierce and unyielding, she knew she had found something worth fighting for and holding on to.